I want to start this part of the lecture by focusing on the idea of nationalism and trying to explain why it's such an important concept with regard to the development of modern Japan. The word nationalism itself is distinctly a modern concept. Before that, whether in Japan or elsewhere, people had some vague sense that they belonged to a particular country, but they didn't really identify themselves in that way. In other words, they thought, I belong to this particular family, maybe I associate with the religion, or I belong to a particular fief in a feudal system, this is my lord, or this is the landowner that I work for. People's local reality really was the primary factor in how they thought about themselves. When we get to the modern era, there's this gradual shift towards identifying oneself as a citizen of a particular country, and that could cut both ways, as say England is going around the world and colonizing it, and then identifying yourself as British is kind of identifying yourself as a kind of conqueror, whereas if you were on the other side of that, as Japan was in the late 19th century, then you might need to think about that nationalism in a different way. It's not so much that you're the conquerors, but rather that you are being threatened by conquest, in this particular case by Japan, conquest by America. That might not have been America's aim, but from Japan's perspective, that's what was going on in the world at that time. Different countries, including China, were being colonized to various extents, and they realized that if they didn't do something, they would be next. And so it's really in that context that we have to think about the development of nationalism in Japan, very much under the threat of being conquered by European nations. Now, in thinking about how they were going to do that, there was actually a revolution, and the previous system of government was, of course, the samurai system, a feudal system, and some of you probably know something about that. In the Tokugawa period from 1600 to 1868, the samurai were the rulers, and the emperor had very little power. The samurais ruled in Tokyo, then called Edo, but the emperor was in Kyoto, and the emperor really had virtually no power at all. And so the idea was to overthrow the government and restore power to the emperor, who historically, for most of Japanese history, did not have a great deal of power. And so the idea was that if they could build up the person of the emperor as this divine figure that everybody should have loyalty to and really should identify with, that would help to create a strong sense of nationalism, make all the people of Japan come onto the same page and be willing to do whatever it took to save the nation from the immediate threat. And so that's precisely what they did. That period, called the Meiji Restoration, begins in 1868, and it's a very important period for the development of modern Japan. It involves Japan developing a constitution and all sorts of modern institutions and technology, and as we'll see in the second part of this lecture, that's ultimately going to lead into World War II. But on the other side, it also leads to the present, where Japan is still one of the most important economies in the world. Our job in this course is to focus on the religious dimension of that, and so for us, the important thing is that the government uses Shinto as a way to create this nationalism, and makes Shinto a state religion. It goes through, in fact, many different attempts to do that, and they're not all successful. But one way or another, from 1868 until the end of World War II, Shinto and Japan, the government of Japan, are very, very closely associated, so much so that, as you can see if you come down here, that we have, a new kind of Shinto. Here you see the emperor surrounded by these foundational deities of the Shinto tradition, and an element that was somewhat present in earlier Japan, but really brought to the fore and emphasized now, this idea that the emperor is a divine figure. Not only is he a descendant of Amaterasu, the sun goddess, but that the enthronement rituals which still take place today when a new emperor is enthroned, that in that ritual the sun goddess essentially comes into the emperor and inspires him to make him into a living deity. And that gets played up quite a bit. It's just the kind of thing that you would want to have everybody funnel their attention to the emperor and do whatever the emperor says, even though in some sense things haven't changed that much, that the politicians around the Meiji emperor and the other emperors after him still continued to have a great deal of persuasion, and a lot of things get done in the emperor's name and without the emperor necessarily being the one in charge. One way this happens is through this idea, Saisei Ichi. You can read about it here, is the idea that the ritual and government are one. That's to say that there's no division between religion and the state. And so that happens right at the beginning of the Meiji Restoration. One more important thing that will set the stage is that the government takes over all of the major Shinto shrines in the country. Without getting into the details of what the previous system was, which was a little messy, but the point is that the government actually appoints priests to the various shrines. It's a long, complicated, and very interesting process that I'm not going to get into here, but if you're interested, there's a wonderful book called Shinto in the State that I can direct you towards, and you could read more about it there. All right, so for now, I'm going to leave it there, and in the next part of the lecture, I'll talk about how this plays out and leads into World War II. But in the meantime, take a look at this material and think about it, and then you can watch the next lecture.